Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're really excited to host this next series as part of the Funder Census Initiative's operational census message and testing results. Today's webinar is going to focus on messaging testing results focused on the undercount of young children and features the Partnership for America's Children. Next slide, please. My name is Jocelyn Bissonette, and I'm the director of the Funder Census Initiative at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. And FCI is a growing network where more than 400 national, state, and community-based foundations and philanthropy-serving organizations can connect, access resources, and mobilize for a fair and accurate census. And you can access information and resources, including our complete messaging testing series, on our website or by contacting me directly. And of course, none of the census efforts happen in isolation. It's a broad collaboration of many organizations. And I specifically want to mention the FCI co-chairs and leadership team, as well as our philanthropic partners, the Democracy Funders Collaborative Census Subgroup and the United Philanthropy Forum. Next slide. This is one of our upcoming, just one example of many of our upcoming program, and you'll hear from our partner today some of the other upcoming programming that's happening. And next slide. And finally, I want to say just a special note of thanks and gratitude to our many co-sponsors, philanthropic and stakeholder co-sponsors for today's programming. A couple of logistics before we kick it off. This is a 60-minute call. A recording and the slide deck will be made available following the webinar that will be available on our website. Throughout the webinar, please make use of the Q&A box to submit your questions. We'll add them to the queue for the discussion following the formal presentation. And finally, FCCP is a 501c3 organization, meaning we do not support or oppose candidates running for public office. And we ask that all presentations, questions, and comments be respectful of this nonpartisan status. And finally, it's my honor to introduce our moderator for today's session, Karen Narasaki. Karen is a national authority on voting rights, census, media, immigrant rights, and race relations. For 2 decades, she was the president, executive director of Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC, where she helped to lead a successful effort to reduce the undercount of minorities in the decennial census. She is a consultant to the Bauman Foundation, which chairs and staffs the census subgroup. And in 2014, President Obama appointed her to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Karen, I'm going to kick it over to you to facilitate today's discussion.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'd like to add my welcome on behalf of the Bauman Foundation and the Democracy Funders Census Subgroup. As Jocelyn noted, we are staffing a collaborative of national and regional funders who have been investing together for a few years in an aligned strategy to ensure a fair and accurate census. One of the goals of the funders is to close the persistent undercount of people of color and other vulnerable households. A top priority for the National Plan of Action that the funders put together in our Get Out the Count strategy is identifying the messengers and messages that will resonate with the communities who have been persistently undercounted. This is the 8th of our messaging webinar series. The videos and slides for the first 7, Color of Change, NALEO, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, the U.S. Census Bureau, the National Congress of American Indians, the Arab American Institute, and Central Valley researchers are available on the FCI website now. This website will be recorded and will also be available. The undercount of young children has grown significantly over the past few decades, so understanding why this is happening and trying to figure out how to convince households to count all of their children is critical. We're fortunate today to have Deborah Stein and Celinda with us to discuss the extensive research they have done together as we count down to 2020. We'll start from hearing from Deb Stein, who's the network director for the Partnership for America's Children. She has more than 30 years of experience in policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children and their families. And she's a nationally recognized advocate on behalf of children and strategic communications expert who is passionate about improving the children's lives through better public policy. Before she came to the partnership in 2015, she spent 8 years at the Hatcher Group, a public affairs and communications firm, where she was vice president of public policy. And she also spent 9 years with Voices for America's Children. And then we'll hear from Celinda Lake, who many of you know as the president and founder of Lake Research Partners. She's a prominent pollster and political strategist. She serves as a tactician and senior advisor to a wide range of foundations, advocacy groups, labor unions, nonprofits, government agencies, and universities. She's well known for cutting-edge research on issues including the economy, healthcare, the environment, and education, and has worked on an innovative messaging project that helps redefine language on race and class, the economy, inequality, big money in politics, climate change, public schools, teachers, reproductive health and rights, and criminal justice reform. The speakers will be presenting for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 25 minutes or so for questions and answers. I invite you to type in questions in the Q&A box as we go through the presentation. So first, Deb, you're up.
Thanks. So I'm really excited to release this research, which the Partnership commissioned from Lake Research to serve the whole Count All Kids initiative. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Count All Kids initiative, we have both a national Count All Kids committee that works to raise awareness at the national level and works with the Census Bureau, and a campaign where we disseminate all of our materials as we produce them. So if you're eager to get the materials we'll produce based on this message research, you can go to countallkids.org and sign up for campaign materials. I wanted to introduce to you the problem that we were trying to analyze when we commissioned this research, because the count of young children in 2010 was really low, and what we've learned is that we miss children for different reasons than adults. Young children, which we define here as birth to age 4, were missed in 2010. Over 2 million young children were missed in that year, and that's a trend that has been growing for 40 years, ever since 1980. So we have a real problem, and if we don't reverse the curve on this, it's only going to get worse. This is even before we deal with the difficult current environment for immigrant families. What our research shows us is that kids are missed for different reasons for adults, and that means we need messages that persuade families to include their young children when they respond to the census. Next slide, please. So here's what we knew from demographic research before we started our communications research. First of all, most of the children that are missed are left off the form when families respond to the census. They're not missed because the whole family didn't respond. The family responds, but the children are left off the form. A lot of the children that are missed live in what are called complex households. Complex households are pretty much anything other than one or two parents and their children. So grandparents, parents, children, aunts and uncles raising children, grandparents raising children without the parents, or two households sharing space because they can't afford to live independently would all count as complex households. And kids, young kids in those households are at greater risk of being missed. We also know that young children are more likely to be left off the form when the person filling out the form is not the parent. So if it's the grandparent, they're more likely to be missed. And if the person is more distantly related or not related to them at all, they're even more likely to be missed. We also know children of color are more likely to be left off the form and to be missed. Next slide, please. And also, we're getting background noise, if someone can mute that person. Bill O'Hare and the Population Reference Bureau have done some research to try and identify which communities have a lot of children at risk of being missed. And their research has shown us that 4 kinds of communities are particularly likely to have a lot of kids missed. Communities with a higher share of racial and ethnic minorities, communities with a lot of linguistically isolated households. That's not immigration status per se, that's about language usage. Communities where a lot of young children live with grandparent householders, and communities where young children are not closely related to the householder. Next slide, please. So when we commissioned this research, when we sat down with Lake Research and worked out what we wanted the research to cover, here's the questions that we set that we were trying to answer. What do young parents and other households with young children know about the census, and what do they think about participating? What do they understand about whether they're supposed to include young children, and what are their concerns about including young children? What messages would persuade them to not only respond to the census, but to include their young children when they do it? And then we did have a small set of questions trying to figure out how to persuade immigrant households to count their young children, because nearly 2 million young children in this country are citizens but live in a household with at least one undocumented adult. And those children, of course, are very much at high risk of being missed. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn this over to Celinda Lake, and she'll tell you what we learned when we tried to answer those questions.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Deb for your tremendous advocacy and intellectual leadership. It's really, really been exciting to be part of this project and to be part of such a thorough investigation. So first of all, in terms of methodology, we started out with 13 in-person and 2 online focus groups in April and May with all kinds of families asking both what their own personal experience was and also asking what reasons they thought that people might not fill out the census. We then did an online survey with 800 parents with children under 5 who make less than $50,000 a year. So we really concentrated on the population at risk here. The error on this survey is plus or minus 3.5%. If we look at some of the key findings, first of all, parents overwhelmingly and grandparents, et cetera, people do have a basic sense of what the census is. They associate it with tracking, counting. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Tracking, counting the population, government, and numbers. In general, they have a positive but impartial, kind of disengaged perception of the census. People do think that participating in the 2020 census will benefit their community. And it's really, really interesting that people make a big distinction between what will benefit them as individuals and what will benefit the neighborhood or the community at large. People tend to see much more readily a connection with the community at large or their neighborhood than they do with them personally. And in fact, as part of messaging strategy, we found that the community link was much, much more believable. And often what's really interesting is that we find that cynicism is our bigger enemy than opposition. And indeed, what we found here was that people were less cynical that their community would benefit than they were cynical that they themselves would benefit. They also felt that if their community had not already benefited, that in the future they might benefit. They could imagine some connections, particularly to schools, infrastructure, healthcare, whereas for themselves, they felt if I haven't seen it already, I'm not going to see it. So the personal, more transactional focus really increases people's skepticism, and the more values-oriented community focus made people more engaged, more interested, more committed. The other thing that was very, very important, and one of the biggest learnings, is we really want to focus on the future and the future of children. And it ended up being very powerful to say to people that the census is once every 10 years, and that could be most of the childhood for a child. So if they're not counted now, they could miss out for most of their childhood. And again, that more values-oriented approach very, very powerful in terms of getting people to be more committed and less threatened by the idea of participating in the census and having all of the children counted. A majority of low-income parents with children under 5 reported some familiarity with the census, but it's very limited familiarity. 62% said they had some familiarity, but only 27% said that they were very familiar. The people most likely to be very familiar were older parents, college-educated parents, African Americans, and then a pop among Latinx parents and Spanish speakers that came, unfortunately, around all of the conversation around the citizenship question. Married parents, partisans, and those who attend religious services often. And so the most familiar tended to be people more rooted, more stable in their communities, more engaged in networks that provide information, and this little blip among Latinx and Spanish-speaking parents around the citizenship controversy. The least familiar were unmarried parents, independents, and people who were less likely to be connected. One thing I want to flag is this connection to whether or not you attend religious ceremonies. And one of the things that's really an organizational base and an opportunity for us in this campaign is working more aggressively with religious institutions, because they really made a very, very big difference in terms of information signing up and a conduit for information. If we look at the next slide, 46% of the parents said they had filled out the census before. Slightly less than a third said they had not filled it out before, and a quarter said they weren't sure. The younger you were, the less likely you were to have filled it out before. College-educated and home-owning parents, much more likely to have filled it out before. Older parents more likely to have filled it out than younger parents. So again, just who was contacted and who has more stable living situations and stable addresses. If we look at the next slide, a solid majority believe it is very important to have an accurate census that counts everyone. 82% think it's important, 56% think it's very important. Now, there are two concepts here. One is an accurate census and one is counting everyone. And interestingly, they're not 100% connected with people. So people thought you could have an accurate census, but you wouldn't necessarily have to count everyone to do that. And so it's important to link the notion of counting everyone with an accurate census. And that word accurate is very powerful to people, and it is particularly powerful to more conservative people. The people that feel it's most important to have an accurate count that counts everyone, white college graduates, people who have lived at their address for a long period of time, men more than women, even though it's women who will remember the children more, homeowners, Republicans, and people who attend religious services. So one of the things that we find here is that our central slogan, if you will, or the central positioning of the census, let's have an accurate census that counts everyone, is actually most salient to the people that are already filling out the census. It's less salient to the people that are not filling out the census or not completely filling out the census. And that was the first indication that we had of many, that there are a number of disconnects here that are contributing benignly, really, not sinisterly, to the problem that we're talking about. 74% of the people say that they are likely to participate in the next census. 51% say they're almost certain to participate. Now, these are pretty low numbers, low intensity, and we definitely have a problem brewing. And the problem is rooted in three different factors. One factor is all of the things that Deb was talking about, particularly complex households, instability, shared custody. These things which contribute to the undercount of children are actually on the rise pretty dramatically in our society. Secondly, people, while they're not rejecting the census, there is kind of low intensity here. Low intensity of information, low intensity of networking, low intensity of certainty, because people overstate their certainty. Parents are 9 points more likely to say they're almost certain after we read our statements. Now, that may not seem like a huge increase, but that is a pretty substantial increase. Because remember, this is in the course of a survey, and people remember what they responded. So they seek to be consistent more than they seek to improve. So this is a pretty good increase. And that increase was the largest with some of the groups that we're most targeting in our efforts. One of the key factors here is residential stability. And residential stability is a threefer. Residential stability is a key predictor of how knowledgeable you are today. It's a key predictor of whether you've had any experience with the census in the past. And it's a key predictor of your willingness to fill out the census and your sense of whether or not you should include everyone or who you should include. The more stable you are in your family, the more stable you are in your residential pattern, the clearer you are in terms of whether or not you're supposed to include everyone or whether you're not including a youngest child, a brand new baby, or someone that's there with you part-time custody. 2/3 of the parents say they would prefer to fill the form out online. Online is a huge opportunity here, and the populations that are not counting younger children are very heavily involved in social media. If not on computers, then definitely on their iPhones. 15% would prefer the mail, 17% would prefer the phone, 8% say they have no preference. But online strategies for getting people information, very, very, very powerful strategies. And people liked a lot the idea of getting information online that went through a variety of scenarios and reminded people, yes, in this situation you should count the child. In this situation you should count the child. Some people said that they preferred completing the survey by mail, but mostly they did it, now the survey was all online, so there was a little bit of a bias there. But the people in the focus groups who said they preferred it by mail tended to note computer issues. And people were very eager to be able to do it on their iPhones as well as on their computer. People who said they would prefer to do it by the phone thought it would allow them to clarify questions in real time. And people assumed that they might have questions about whether to include someone or not, and that it would not be that easy for them to get answers if they were online rather than being on the phone. Almost everyone, and this was not the only study that has confirmed this, almost every family with young children, including low-income families, have internet access. So they weren't reporting so much their own inability to get online. They were more cautious about how other people would be affected. People did not like at all the idea of door-to-door census. They thought it was very intrusive, high risk. They would not open the door, and they were not at all excited about a door-to-door sampling. Nearly 1 in 5 said they would not include children under 5 on the census, or they were not sure. So that's 18% of the population. That's a pretty significant number. The subgroups who are least familiar with the census, not surprisingly, least sure about whether they would participate or not. And so we have a bunch of young parents coming online with young children who really, really are not very familiar with the census. And that makes for some very big divisions between college educated and not, but by race, by how many children you have, And again, this variable of lack of familiarity with the census, a very, very important variable for us, and means that campaigns to get people to participate should start now with increasing people's familiarity and posing scenarios to people about who should be included and who should not. When we ask people not whether or not they would fill it out and include children, but whether or not why people would be left off, and people were surprised at the number of people who would be left off, they had very ready explanations about why this wouldn't happen. First of all, half of the people said, I can easily imagine people not filling out because they're not sure whether to include a child or not. And that's very, very interesting, because this is a situation where people tend to upgrade their own behavior, but are more honest about the behavior of others. And there really is in today's fluid, unstable society, there really is a remarkable lack of clarity about whether or not people should be included, who's going to count the person and who's not. There was also, people felt some sentiment that why does the government need to know about the youngest children? People were thinking that once a child gets in school, that kind of thing, then there's a good reason why the government should know if they're there. But why they would need to know when the child is very young, a number of people were kind of nonplussed by that. And what helped was to remind people this happens only every 10 years. So we're talking about the future, and we're talking about what may be the bulk of the childhood of a child. That if they're not counted now, they might be missed for their whole childhood. And that was very salient to people. That was an aha moment, particularly for moms. There were also a number of scenarios of mobility and part-time residents where people thought, no, I think somebody else is counting the child, or no, you wouldn't count the child in this situation. Adults living somewhere else who have custody of the children or shared custody. Children are living in a household temporarily, house surfing. People are living in the household some days, but other days living somewhere else. And that the children aren't the children of the homeowner or the renter, but are the child of someone else. So people readily could imagine scenarios where they would be confused. And again, really, really helpful to tell people how to handle different situations. We told people, well, people could readily imagine scenarios where kids were not counted, they were stupefied by the number. They thought 2 million missing was a very big number. And 2/3 of the parents thought they were concerned about this. 39% very concerned. College-educated men, parents who attend religious services, Latinx women, and parents who are most likely to fill out the census were the most concerned. So this is a little bit of a mixed finding, because the people that are most likely to leave children off tended to feel a little less intensity. The people that are already most likely to fill out the census are the ones who are most concerned about children being left off the census. One of the things that made people more likely to participate, and we had found this in other research that we have done on turnout, it really, really helps in today's world to tell people that the census, you can fill out the census on your own schedule, and it only takes about 10 minutes. That made 3/4 of the people more likely to participate, 53% much more likely. That was really important to women. And women really like this idea of being able to do things on their own schedule, and that it only takes a short amount of time, because many women feel literally the most precious commodity they have is time. The privacy guarantee was also important to people. And the language that we used was, the Census Bureau has one of the strongest privacy guarantees in the federal government. If a Census Bureau employee reveals personal data collected in the census, that person can spend up to 5 years in jail or pay a fine as large as $250,000. That was, not surprisingly, very important to Latinx parents. It was also very important to parents who thought, okay, my child is too young. Why does the government need to know about my child this young? Regardless of introducing people with or without background. So we introduced, some of the people got the context, counting everyone where they live and sleep most of the time, even if the living arrangement is temporary, so long as the person doesn't have a permanent address, didn't really make a huge difference in whether or not people counted children. What makes more of a difference in terms of people counting children is actually providing scenarios and telling people what to do in that scenario. People were most likely to include children, thought that children should be included if they were too young for school, if they stayed in the household all of the time, if they were a grandchild or foster child in the household all the time, if they were the child of a living girlfriend or boyfriend. And again, you can see here as we go down this list on this slide, the key variables here for people are permanency rather than temporary, and whether or not they have their own rooms. Again, which is a sign of stability and permanency. The things that people thought were confusing, if a child or grandchild stays in the household some days but not all of the time, and that was very, very interesting because that was confusing to people about who should count the child, but also a lot of grandparents in the focus group said that they didn't want to undermine their own children by counting the grandchildren. They thought that undermined the identity and the responsibility of the children, their children. And so there were two for here in terms of both confusion and kind of values orientation, if you will. That a family member and their young child stays in the household some days but not all the time, and a friend and their young child stays in the household some days but not all the time. And you can see here that the two key variables for people are temporary status and stability. And they don't know how to handle those situations. And of course, as we all know, and you're are the experts, those situations are dramatically increasing in our society. We then looked at key messages. And this slide is kind of our core message scenario. And there are several things that are really powerful here about the strongest arguments. First, they don't deal with personal benefits, they deal with community benefits. Benefits for children, but benefits at the community or neighborhood level. Two, they're values-oriented. They are not purely transactional. They talk about most of their childhood, 10 years, their future. Three, they focus on local government rather than national government. People were highly skeptical that they would get anything from federal funds. So the local government message was extremely important here. And you can see that our strongest statements were counting your children in the census means your local schools will get more funding for your children. The census happens once every 10 years, so if we don't count a 2-year-old, your community will have less funding for education, childhood, and services they need for 10 years, most of their childhood. The census helps local government in listing the services, and the census will help local government meet the future with $800 billion a year in federal funding and then naming some specific programs. It also helped a lot to mention concrete specific programs. You can see on the next slide the messages and how these messages translated into being very convincing. Now, just to give you a sense of this, we consider a message compelling to people when we get 40 to 45% very convincing. Here, of course, you can see that we're getting 54 to 57% very convincing. So we have very successful message strategies here, and what's really important is getting out those message strategies. If we look at the next slide, the key to all of the message strategies were, one, values, not just programs. Now, the one value that didn't work was democracy. Democracy was very esoteric to these parents, even more esoteric to the parents who aren't likely to participate and are low information. They're not, frankly, heavy voters to begin with. They also liked concrete programs, not vagueness. So they liked things specifically talked about in the way they lead their lives, like childcare, food, health care, schools. It helps to give examples of what losses will be if children are not counted. It really helps to talk about the 10 years because it makes people motivated to include young children who they think are too young to be the beneficiary of programs if they just think about a single year's count. And the idea that missing children for the next 10 years is missing them for most of their childhood. That was a very, very salient point to people. We looked at targeting. We looked at several different kinds of people, persuadable parents, people who shift toward filling out the census, and people who shift toward being more willing to participate in the census. So a variety of different kinds of targeting. And again, what we found is local important, future important, schools critical, because people thought in general, even if they were going to miss kids under 5, that by the time they get to school, kids should be counted. And so mentioning that as a concrete benefit now is very, very powerful to people. We did do some of the research prior to the Supreme Court decision on the census, and we did look at the power, what happened in terms of the citizenship question, and people were very nervous, and Latinx families, very nervous. Latinx families tended to have heard about the citizenship question already. It fit into a paradigm that they had already about Trump immigration policies, and it was scary to people, very scary to people. There was some power to learning about Title 13, and they really thought that this information about privacy and fines should get out broadly to the Latino community. We found, by the way, in subsequent research that we've done, and Karen has been part of this research, that because of the initial experimentation where forms were sent out with the citizenship question on it, there are quite a few people, including Latinx families, who are confused now about whether the citizenship question is on it or not. By the way, in the survey, about half of Latinx parents and half of people had not heard about the Supreme Court decision and had not heard about the citizenship question. If we look at the messaging on citizenship, we see a similar message triangle. It's important to count all young children because they are citizens of this country and will grow up here. The reassurance on the privacy, revealing personal data from the census is a felony, punishable by 5 years in jail and a fine of $250,000. And then coming back to the Constitution requires a count every 10 years of every person living in the country, and that includes immigrants and citizens. So those were all very, very important answers to the citizenship question. And we should not assume that we are done with the citizenship question just because it's off the census form now. Two groups of people really stood out, or 3 groups of people stood out actually, as important conduits of information to families. 1 were teachers, 2 were service providers and medical providers, and 3 were religious institutions. We did some fascinating and very exciting focus groups among providers of services and medical providers who interact with young children. And they were really, really fascinating in terms of understanding how to get help from them in this endeavor. First of all, the providers were optimistic. They did believe that their patients and families would and should fill out the census, but they were very worried about the citizenship question, and they were very worried about lack of information. And they were worried about encouraging people to participate around the census if they didn't know what the status of the citizenship question was. They are very willing to be more proactive. They felt like they needed information in multiple languages to help reach out, and they particularly like the ideas of flyers, videos, tip sheets, infographics, pamphlets, because they thought that, there's only so much time that I've got in the office, so I really need some aids as well, both in terms of how to do this effectively and in terms of how information I can give to families. They thought it would be also very important for information to be accompanied by information at schools, television, grocery stores, and other program offices. They wanted to emphasize that we needed concise, simple messages that make the importance between the importance of the census and patients and families very, very clear, and they were very willing to be validators for that approach. Finally, in terms of strategies, some interesting strategies that we learned about.
Hi, Celinda. I'm going to need you to wrap up, so if we have a lot of questions coming in. Do you want to take 30 seconds?
Okay, sure. I've only got 2 more slides, so we'll make this pretty quick. First of all, most of the messaging is pretty transactional. Existing messages is transactional. That doesn't work very well. And in fact, one of our major goals is to fight cynicism, and transactional conversations actually make people more cynical because they think, well, if I were going to get so much, I would have seen it already. Our challenge is to overcome cynicism, get people to take action, and connect the dots for them. And in connecting the dots, there are 2 issues that we have. Making sure that people understand why leaving off youngest children would affect them. It's 4-10 years. And giving people information about different scenarios. In terms of other strategies, we need to connect with other institutions. Teachers, religious services, religious institutions, medical providers, service providers. Even though the citizenship question is off, we need to provide reassurance about privacy. We need to understand that young and mobile and temporary parents, temporary resident parents, are going to go very, very heavily to Google and online to find answers to scenarios. And we need to set up answers online in a way that they come up readily, concisely to people. We need to understand that parents and grandparents can be very good messengers to adult children about counting their grandchildren. And again, direct service providers can be useful as well. So let me stop there. And Deb, I don't know if there's anything else you want to underscore, and then turn it back, Karen, to you.
The only thing I want to point out, if we go to the very last slide, is that we're going to be building materials that you can use in your organizations and putting them on our website. And so if you go to countallkids.org and sign up, you'll get notices every time we have materials that you can pull down and use. So I encourage you to do that. And what you're signing up for is the campaign materials. Karen?
Yes, thanks, Deb. And let me add that that Deb is thinking about doing a second webinar to dig further into this data. So if there are particular questions that you'd love to hear that addressed, feel free to put that in the Q&A. We've gotten asked many times whether these slides are going to be available because a lot of material was covered. They will be available. It'll take about a week. They'll be up on the FCCP Funder Census Initiative page, as well as Deb will have it on the countallkids.org site as well. So wait a week. I think you will also get a notice if you signed up for this webinar that the materials are available. So we only have about 10 minutes left for Q&A, and we have about 270 people lined up on this webinar, so let me go quickly. So Sophia asks, are we encouraged to copy these messages verbatim into our own census materials?
The answer is yes, except for the one about change where we used a hypothetical. And so I would use a message about change, but I wouldn't give the specific 50,000 city or whatever we put in there. That was to test the impact. We're looking for other good examples that are not hypothetical that we can use. But absolutely, anything except that when used, create a more general change one.
So Carrie asks, are there census posters or materials available yet geared towards parents? I'd like to put them up in our Head Start centers. I will add that the Census Bureau has a partnership page. They will also be putting out materials that you can use. Deb, I'm sure you have an answer to that question.
So we have not created our specific materials yet. We'll be doing that and then testing them into focus groups. They will be going out in October or November. I will also give Jocelyn a link to the Census Partnership page where there's already some young child materials. But if you sign up, again, you'll get our materials when they're ready.
Great. Katie asks, were focus group participants interested in the dollar amount lost, or was it enough just to know that there were concrete programs that were going to lose funding?
Celinda?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think it goes back to the point that you were making about change, Deb. So they were interested in less the amount lost than the amount gained. So people were more interested in participating if it would provide a good than if it would remedy a bad. And in fact, remedying a bad made people kind of cynical. Now, it did help to talk about missed children, and that means schools, health insurance, housing, transportation. But in general, I would say you want to talk, what we want to do is give an example of where an accurate count produced an increase for a community rather than a loss.
Great. Hannah asks, given how confused parents may be about the citizenship question, should we proactively mention lack of citizenship question when we present folks, or should we not mention it unless someone brings it up and instead focus on the Title 13 protections?
It's a really good question. We didn't test that, so I don't know. My instincts would be just provide the protection and don't bring up the citizenship.
And if I can add to that, we also had a question about people who are afraid in Section 8 housing if they have people there that aren't supposed to be there. That's reassuring to a wide group of people, not just immigrants. And being very specific about what the protections are really seems to make people calmer because they are so strict. So don't just say there are protections. Say it's a $250,000 fine and up to 5 years in jail.
Yes, someone also had asked about the concern that I know comes up in a lot of low-income families where they're in public housing and the dad is not supposed to be there, right? So they're afraid to count the dad. Do you have a response for that?
It's the same response. Give the confidentiality information because it is so strong that people are clearly reassured and more likely to respond fully. Give the specific penalties for releasing individual data.
So Raim asked, did any of the sample groups include Asian American families? Celinda?
Yes, of course, Asian American families were included in the data. We didn't do an oversample of Asian American families, but they were included in the sample.
Great. Katie asks, where's the best place to point those in complex households who are questioning who should count the children based on their scenario? Is there a Q&A somewhere? For example, my daughter's father and I do not live together. Who should count her?
Yeah, we have a fact sheet that the Census Bureau has reviewed that we're just finalizing. It will be up on countallkids.org. And again, when it goes up, we'll send out an email. So in a few weeks, you'll have something to point people to there.
Leah asks, with the messaging around the importance to count kids because they are citizens, Do you expect this could also have unintended consequences of not counting some children in the family if they're undocumented and not citizens?
Celinda?
Well, the thing that we emphasized was that everyone should be counted. Everybody who lives here should be counted, and that was the best language. It's interesting, the citizenship status of children, the citizenship status of parents was raised quite a bit. The citizenship status of children was not raised very much as a concern. And so, but the citizenship status of parents was raised as a concern. So I think the best thing is just really to emphasize and to use that language that we had, that everyone should be counted.
Great. Esperanza asks, any messaging insights on residents in non-traditional housing arrangements? For example, a family that might live in a trailer in the backyard of a house.
Oh yeah, same kind of thing. I mean, we had people volunteer, like in one of our Latino groups, we had a situation that volunteered. We had a number of people volunteering a room rental, and it's part and parcel of this whole situation, and that's a good another example. Although people tended to think of trailers as separate residencies, but in general, all of that kind of instability and shared space was confusing to people.
So Rodolfo asks, curious about learning more about the focus groups analysis. Will more information be available at any time?
Celinda? Could we
Well, I mean, yeah, the transcripts are available now, and as long as you're fine, Deb, we're fine having everything posted.
Okay, I'll make a note.
Is that what you mean?
I think that if you're interested, you could probably contact Deb, and her contact information will be put on the discussion page so that you can find it. And then she can work out what she's able to share.
I'm happy to share anything that's useful, but some of it is so bulky that you might be better off with summaries.
Exactly.
So Brianna asks, how can the census be shared with homeless families so they can also be counted? I know online it requires a code from a mailed item. Is there a way to fill out the census for these families who don't have a mailing address?
So I'll take that one. We really have two different kinds of families for that answer. Group one is families that are doubled up and their host family, so to speak, doesn't report them, but they have a place where they're living, an apartment where they're living temporarily. There is a way to fill out a census form without having that specific address, and there's a way to do it even if the household has already submitted a form, and the fact sheet that we're putting out in a couple of weeks spells out how to do that. The key thing to know is you really need to put in as much information as you can about everyone who lives there. The Bureau will take out the double counts, and the reason is so they know you really live there. Families who are living in shelters, in tents, on the street are counted through different systems, either group quarters or another system. I forget what it's called, and we have not yet figured out, but I will pursue this with the Census Bureau, how best those families can make sure that they're counted. But if they're doubled up, they should use the doubled up address, even if that means submitting a separate form without the address.
Gil asks, any resources for Spanish-speaking minors who will be helping parents fill out the census?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is we need to develop them.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
I'm sure, Gil, that NALEO, the NALEO Education Fund, which has a special website, Hagase Cantar, will be putting out is putting out actually a lot of information in Spanish, as is the Census Bureau. In addition, there will be outreach that's being done through the schools as well on that question, and we're working with the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers so that they can get all of their teachers up to speed. But I would definitely look at the NALEO site. Let's see.
By the way, and that was true in the Asian American community as well, and other work that we did for AAPIA, that this children helping fill out is a big issue. It doesn't really cover the missing children piece, though. That doesn't tend to be the scenario where kids are missed, but it is a big, big factor.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. There will be materials available in many different Asian languages. With the Advancing Justice AAJC, they have a special census site. There will also be materials in Arabic languages that are available through the Arab American Institute and American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. So, and then also for Black immigrants, the BAJI will also, Black Alliance for Immigrant Justice is also going to be making sure there are some materials. So one of the questions is, did the focus groups include people in rural areas? What did they say about completing the last census?
So we didn't particularly focus on people in rural areas. The survey included people in rural areas, but we did not do focus groups in rural areas. We could, and that might be an interesting point for the next census. Given the patterns of where young children are missed, it tends to be more urban, I think. But anyway, we did not do it, and we could easily do it. We do rural focus groups all the time.
We did do 2 in Stockton, and I'm happy to share the recordings from those. I'm not sure that really qualifies as rural, but it certainly wasn't a big city.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good point.
So we are going to be closing the website in a couple of minutes. So if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we will document them, and Deb will try to respond to them after the webinar. Also be on the lookout for, there are special briefing sheets that are available on the Count 2020 website, and there's a special sheet on how homeless people will be counted that Georgetown put together. So lots of materials, and we'll be trying to get the responses out. So I will take one more question. Katie asked, the Census Bureau claims that 1 million children were missed. How did you quantify that 2 million were missed?
So actually, our data is census data too. There were 2 million children missed, but there were also about 1 million children double counted. So the final national number is about 1 million lower than it should have been. That's the difference between the number of omissions and what's called the net undercount. They're both census data numbers. We think the omitted number is more relevant to why it matters for missing kids, so we use the 2 million. And we'll be putting up a blog soon trying to explain that distinction, because I know it gets confusing. The 1 million number is the net undercount, and all the state and county data you'll see are also net undercounts, which means more children were actually missed in individual communities, but then double counted.
So we'll be making sure that Deb's email will be sent around to all of you for any remaining questions. And I am going to turn this over to Jocelyn. Jocelyn. Maybe we lost Jocelyn.
I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the time and the expertise of Karen and Deborah and Celinda. This was a really rich discussion. And I think we can tell by the number of participants and the robust questions that we received that this is such a critical issue and an important issue that we all need to keep in mind as we continue to educate and mobilize towards a fair and accurate count. I did link to Deborah's contact information if you have follow-up questions. As we mentioned, the recording and the webinar slides will be available on our website, on the FCI website next week. And did just want to make a final plug for the 5th Census Operations webinar that FCI will be co-hosting on September 18th at 1 p.m. I'm going to link to the registration link here in the chat box. Thank you so much again to our speakers and to all of our participants, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.